Okay, we're going to talk about chapter 15, section 1. The first assessment statement describing the need for spontaneous origin life on Earth. If you look over, we have 4 processes needed. The first process, organic molecules, must be made from inorganic molecules that were around at the time. We have to have the ability for polymerization to make the larger molecules like fatty acids, amino acids, sugars. Must have some type of material that can be used to reproduce. Like right now we pass on the DNA as our hereditary material. Must find a way to get rid of water. Why do we have to find a way to get rid of water? Well, it goes against polymerization. Back in chapter 3, we learned for water, if you take a disaccharide like lactose, add water to it, it's going to break it apart. If we take starch, add water to it, it's also going to break it apart. Triglycerides, water breaks it apart. Proteins, water breaks it apart. So water is going to try to keep polymerization from happening, so we have to find a way to get the water out. Our next part of the assessment statements, talking about D2 through D4, is talking about how do we have the organic matter on Earth. And that's going to be our first process we have to look at from step 1 is the organic molecules. If we look at some notes here, our book's going to talk about 6 different ways of getting organic molecules. Miller and Urey is going to be talking about how molecules are created. Comets are going to talk about how organic molecules were delivered to the Earth. Space is talking about how molecules could have been created. Wet-dry conditions are both going to show how molecules could have been created and how they showed up on Earth. Same with volcanoes and deep in the oceans. First we'll look at is the Miller-Urey experiment. In your book, you have the figure that we can look at. They took the molecules that they think were around at the time, with water, ammonia, and methane, put that into their apparatus, allowed sparks, and also we have the water to it would boil and condense. They're just trying to find a way to show what type of conditions were available on Earth at the time and see what they can make. And what they ended up with is, look on the next page. It says they found that organic compounds such as amino acids formed inside the primordial soup. And so they were able to come up with a way to make organic molecules, trying to show what it was like on Earth back in the time. Another way they think that molecules could have made to Earth is from the comets. Our planet was bombarded with showers of comets, and organic molecules could have hitchhiked on the comets and could have came to Earth that way. Along with that, they talk about how molecules could be made in space. Organic molecules can form in space, and could explain how comets could have carried these molecules here, because in the laboratory they were able to show the conditions of space, and they were able to have amino acids synthesized if they reproduce those situations. And then your book also talks about the alternating wet-dry conditions. How alternating wet-dry conditions can have organic molecules form. And then it talked about how near volcanoes there's a source of rich materials plus the warmth volcanic activity could have formed amino acids. And to show how they think that life could have existed on Earth, they look at the deep oceans with the underwater geysers. And if we see what the book says over here, the book says entire communities are living underground near these vents, creatures that have never seen before. This gives credibility to the hypothesis that earliest forms of life could have formed deep in the ocean. And so this part here is, do we have an answer? And then it talks about some things to think about on whether we think these processes really happened or not. Next thing we'll talk about is what we had to look at. We talked about how molecules could have occurred on Earth. Now we're going to take a quick look at what type of genetic material could we have that would allow it to reproduce. RNA's role early in life. Our hereditary material is DNA. Problem is, DNA needs enzymes in order to replicate. There were no enzymes around before the DNA, and so they had to come up with some type of material that can replicate that wasn't DNA. And what they have concluded is that single-stranded RNA is able to replicate itself without the aid of enzymes, so it can self-replicate. And also, RNA can act as an enzyme in order to allow itself to replicate. So they think this might have been the way that genetic material was passed on from one organism to another, is using a RNA that can self-replicate. Our next thing we got to look at is how do we deal with polymerization and keeping water out of the way. And their thoughts on that has to do with protobionts. They are microspheres, kind of like tiny bubble-like structures. They maintain a chemistry inside, which was different than the chemistry of that around the surroundings. If you look at the picture I have drawn over here, this could be a protobiont. We have good conditions for polymers to form on the inside and bad conditions on the outside. And so if these could surround the material, a polymer could form inside. This is what they're looking at as the first membrane type material, and this could have been the first thing that led to our cells today. Back in the text, we have to look at another question we have to wonder about is, where did all the oxygen come from? Well, what they think is millions and billions of years ago, certain bacteria were able to develop, and they developed the capacity to photosynthesize. With this photosynthesis, of course, we have lots of sunlight, so there was an inexhaustible source of energy that could be used to produce the oxygen. So the anaerobic bacteria, which survived, were those living in the mud or places to protect them from the new oxygen-rich atmosphere that the cyanobacteria were produced from the photosynthesis. So as a result, photosynthetic bacteria proliferated and produced more and more oxygen. Today, with the help of plants and other photosynthetic organisms, we have an oxygen around 21%. Interesting fact that if it gets any higher, that would be a problem because it would allow for more fires to break out if we had an oxygen content greater than our 21%. Another thing they have to worry about is how do we get molecules inside of a cell? And we have a theory called endosymbiotic theory, a theory of how the prokaryotes developed inside eukaryotes. This theory states that organelles found inside the cells today were once independent prokaryotes. They were engulfed by a larger cell, but kept alive inside the cell instead of being digested. This would explain how a membrane-bound organelle, like a mitochondria or a chloroplast, could become part of a cell. If we look deeper into that thought, we have our cell that will engulf a prokaryote, and the prokaryote would live inside, provide energy for the cell, kind of like a mitochondria or a chloroplast, will allow this cell to live just being in the sun and produce energy for it. Some problems with this, though, is does the ability to engulf another cell and have it survive in the cytoplasm, that really doesn't guarantee that the host cell can pass this on to the offspring through the genetic code synthesize the newly acquired organelle. In other words, we do not have the DNA inside this cell to produce another organelle that it just engulfed, is what they're trying to say. How do they pass that on? So this is just a thought on section 1 from chapter 15.